Last night, our Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, delivered a speech which filled me with rage. The language chosen, most of which was vague and untrue, centred around the government being both powerful and supremely benevolent. He told us that our people engaged in an act of voluntary cooperation without the threat of force or coercion, and that science has always informed him of the steps chosen. He eventually went on to tell the Irish people that he was now going to relinquish most of the freedom stolen, but of course mentioning that he still has the power to retract that freedom should we need his protection. But while many will no doubt celebrate being gifted the freedom to go to the cinema or a bar or restaurant, I would suggest that such individuals have missed the point entirely. This nightmare is not over, and our political establishment must hold on to the idea that danger still lurks. I believe that the Irish government have made so many mistakes and committed so many crimes that it will be important for them to continue the farce so that they may have a defence when the time comes to hold them to account. In this video, I will highlight some of the damage caused by our political establishment, at least from my perspective. In March 2020, the government created the Health Preservation Act. This piece of legislation relegated every citizen of Ireland to a slave, and it took them 48 hours to propose and sign off on it. As far as I'm concerned, those involved subverted our constitution and acted in accordance with the definition of the common good, which supported their agenda and decimated the civil liberties of the Irish people. It included restrictions to your life, which saw you as a prisoner in your own home, unless you had a government excuse which granted you permission to leave. And if one of the many guarded checkpoints, set up purely to intimidate, were to find out that you left your home for reasons personal to you, you were punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. Your right to freedom of movement was decimated under this law, and it must also be said that social isolation born out of this despicable policy has taken a heavy toll on those who are mentally vulnerable, and in many cases, people have not recovered from it. Every business in Ireland deemed non-essential by a small group of politicians was forced to close. Whether you had bills to pay or a family to feed, your doors would either close or you were punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. And while we're on the subject of the non-essential, I will highlight again, because it must never be forgotten, that Damien English TD declared that clothes were not essential, and to buy or sell such items would likely have seen you punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. The government ensured that our elderly were placed into nursing homes and kept behind a wall of regulations to prevent many from visiting. The people who built our country, the people who did everything to make sure that the lives of those left behind would be exponentially better than their own. They were simply left to die alone. The best many of them could hope for, as they slipped into eternal darkness, was a wave from behind a screen or a goodbye on an iPad, and to break the rules in order to comfort your dying loved one would no doubt see you punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. I wish to point out that Pater Tobin, TD of Aintu, has been pushing to have the government policy in relation to the nursing homes investigated for months, with little cooperation from those in power. It is speculated that over 2,000 of our elderly died while under the conditions I just spoke of as a result of this policy. The government made mandatory the wearing of face coverings unless you as an individual had a government excuse to prevent you from wearing one. This particular policy, which dictates what you can and cannot wear, was the first step on the collective authoritarian ladder. Every citizen in this country who tended towards tyranny turned into a piece of shit overnight. The devout conformists of society began to interrogate and harass those not wearing face coverings, regardless of the reasons presented for not being able to wear one, and their disgusting, rude activities were celebrated. Business owners up and down the country engaged in a practice of banning those unable to wear a mask from entering their stores, unless they viewed private medical documents proving that the unmasked individual before them had an exemption, and failure to provide such information typically led to public ridicule. And of course, failure to comply with this government policy came with the threat of being punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. In fact, this policy created an extraordinarily hostile environment and indeed induced an unnecessary level of stress on those unable to wear a face covering. I only wish I could impose their suffering on those who caused it to show them exactly how it feels. This was also the start of mass ostracization in our country, and indeed the psychosis which gave rise to a religious collective of Covid conformists, as well as the divide. Ireland's children and young people have had to deal with catastrophic learning losses, as well as losing out on the many social activities which are important for health and development. The impact on their lives through fear and propaganda emanating from the various government institutions has served to ostracize and induce stress and anxiety. The impact on families and friendships has been unfathomably strained over the last 2 years. The government policy of locking people and families up in quarantine hotels, which were monitored by the army and the guards, caused intense levels of undue stress on those being incarcerated. Individual freedom was again casualty in this situation, and those seeking to escape such a facility would risk being punished by way of a fine or prison sentence. Further on in the pandemic, when the so-called vaccines became available to the public, it was promised that immunity and normality awaited all who sacrificed their bodies. This miracle concoction was supposed to stop infection, stop the spread, stop hospitalization, and of course, it was supposed to be 100% safe. The vast majority of our population took the opportunity to take the injection, with many presenting themselves as the moral individual doing their part to help society. This false moral position, which was used to coerce the hesitant through emotional blackmail, was used to further divide the country into two groups, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. It also gave rise to new legislation which legalized the discrimination of a large portion of the population based on their health or vaccination status. Each citizen vaccinated would receive a digital COVID certificate which would grant them more freedom than their unvaccinated neighbour. This policy served to segregate society into a two-tier system, with the vast majority continuing about their daily business, oblivious to the moral problem of what was taking place. Others, of course, who represented the collective of the COVID cult, many of whom hold positions in media, politics, and other prominent sectors, took the opportunity to vilify those who value freedom and bodily autonomy. Months were spent discussing the many ways to force and coerce the last remaining citizens to take the vaccine, with the most popular ideas being mandatory vaccination and expanding the COVID certificate to all areas of life, particularly supermarkets. TDs and senators stood tall in both the Dáil and the Seanad and proudly announced that the unvaccinated of this country were selfish and an unnecessary drain on resources. And being the morally bankrupt nation that we are, the vast majority of our supposed neighbours did not care. Eventually, the government targeted Ireland's children once again. Firstly, by making them wear face coverings at school for hours at a time, and secondly, by offering the vaccines to children aged 5 and above. All of this and more took place over a course of 2 years, and it was next to impossible for anyone to speak the truth. The self-proclaimed fact-checkers of politics, social media, and the mainstream media censored every opinion, scientific or not, that ran counter to the dominant narrative. The only truth allowed to enter the public space was their truth. At this stage, I would like to say the following. Those of us who value freedom, individual liberty, and bodily autonomy, those of us who marched the streets in defiance of government tyranny, were right. When we said the government were fascist and tyrannical in their approach, we were right. When we said lockdowns cause more harm than good, we were right. When we said that do not work, we were right. When we said that the vaccines do not prevent infection, stop the spread, and are not safe, we were right. When we said that the digital certificate would be used domestically and as a tool to discriminate and control, we were right. We were right about a great many things throughout this crisis, and although few seemed to care, I wish to thank those in the minority who have been fighting tooth and nail for human rights and justice. But please realise that this battle will not end with the restrictions, but with the freedom stolen being rightfully placed back in the hands of the sovereign individual. And in closing, I wish to say the following. The government chose punishment instead of trust to achieve their goals, and their arrogance as well as their ineptitude should be punished. And I want my pound of flesh.